Good morning, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the Center for European Legal Studies and the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law joint webinar on the impact of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine on the EU legal order. My name is Markus Gehring. I was director of the Center for European Legal Studies, and I'm going to chair this webinar this morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. It gives me enormous pleasure to host not just our distinguished speaker, Dr. Luigi Lonardo, but also our colleagues from the Ukrainian Catholic University based in Lviv, Dr. Nataliya Haletska, who is going to welcome us, and I will later introduce Professor Taras Leshkovych and Dr. Maxim Koliba as respondents to our speaker. Nataliya is a senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law. She's chair of the Commission of European Integration and International Cooperation at the Lviv Regional Council, and she's a member of the Lviv Regional Board of the Ukrainian Bar Association. Dr. Haletska, Nataliya, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Dear colleagues, it is my distinct pleasure to be here and to open a very important webinar. This is a webinar which starts a very fruitful cooperation between the Cambridge University Center of European Legal Studies and the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law. Indeed, since the full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine in February 2022, much has been written, many articles, many books, but the book we will be discussing today is really an important piece of research which lays a very interesting foundations to be discussed. It combines legal analysis with a political, diplomatic analysis, with the analysis how all we can win, how can we move closer the peace and stability and the victory of Ukraine. This is a really very important discussion. So it is my pleasure that we can join our efforts in this mutually beneficial discussion and further make our victory closer. So I thank you for inviting us, and I wish all of you a very fruitful discussion, which can result in further and future publications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I should also welcome you all on behalf of the CELS co-directors, Professor Oko Dudu and Dr. Emilia Lenata, to this important event going forward. Our speaker for today is Dr. Luigi Lonardo. He's a lecturer in law at University College Cork in Ireland and a visiting lecturer in European foreign security and defense policy at Sciences Po in Paris, France. He joined Cork after completing his PhD in European Union law at King's College London. He's the author of EU Common Foreign and Security Policy After Lisbon, Between Law and Geopolitics, and his most recent publication that he's going to introduce to us today, Russia's 2022 war against Ukraine and the EU foreign policy reaction, published earlier this year. Dr. Lonardo, you have the floor.
Thank you Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be part of the conversation and, in fact, to kick off the discussion. And let me express my gratitude to the Center for European Legal Studies in Cambridge and to the colleagues of the Ukrainian Catholic Universities for joining and discussing today's presentation. What I'm going to do today is to give a brief overview of the impact of the war on the legal order of the European Union. And in doing so, I will introduce briefly the object and purpose of the book that was very kindly recalled in the introduction, but I'm also genuinely interested in going beyond what is in the book. And for that reason, I am going to focus on the perspective of the European Union, although I shall have inevitably something to say also about the United Kingdom and the United States. And I will say very little about Ukraine itself, because I would like to leave this for the discussion. So my talk today will proceed in 3 points. First, I will introduce the object and purpose of the book and its main arguments. I will then say one thing about the political impact on the war and focus most of the presentation on the impact on the EU legal order. So why have I written this book and what is in this book? The rationale for it is to share scholarship. I thought I was in a good position to provide the EU foreign policy perspective because it is at the intersection between my areas of scholarship and of personal interests. The war is also an intellectually stimulating case study on complex causality, because there are desires and beliefs of individuals who are involved in this. There are also more general factors such as macroeconomics, geopolitics, and also the perceptions that nations have about their own role in history and in geography. The purpose of the book is to offer my commentary and to synthesize scholarship in 3 fields: international relations, law, and Russian studies. The book does not seek to advance scholarship in 3 fields. It seeks to put together insights from them in order to offer an introductory overview. And if I may, it was difficult in the book to keep my strong emotions down and to separate facts from interpretation, from my interpretation. But I think that I have endeavored to do that as best as I could. Having said that, what has the EU done? What is the EU foreign policy reaction? I think we can schematically distinguish 3 things. The EU has adopted sanctions against Russia and Belarus in support of Ukraine. These sanctions were adopted in successive waves or packages, as the EU institutions call them. They are the harshest in the EU sanction history, and they contain, as I will try to explain later, an element of constitutional experimentation. The EU has also provided humanitarian assistance. We can recall the first activation of the Temporary Protection Directive. The EU has also given humanitarian assistance to the neighboring countries to assist with the immigration from Ukraine. The EU has also provided financial assistance, both directly, macroeconomic assistance to Kiev, and indirectly through financing the member states so that these would be able to transfer for free or at a low price weapons to Ukraine. The argument of the book is that there are 2 arguments, really. The reaction of the EU to the war, the reaction that I have just mentioned, is shaped by 2 constraints. One is military dependence on the US and NATO, which meant that no EU country wanted to take on Russia militarily alone. And the second is energy dependence on Russia, which created the complex patterns of decision-making when it came to sanctioning the Russian oil sectors. The reaction of the EU is therefore a compromise between these two constraints. Given these two limits, the choices of the EU were oriented on offering a form of diplomatic, indirect support to Ukraine. And this leads me to the second argument of the book, which is the one that I will develop in the rest of the presentation. That is that the reaction, the foreign policy reaction of the EU was not revolutionary in terms of institutional and legal structure. So in terms of actors, processes, and tools, outcomes, the reaction of the EU was nothing new, was not revolutionary, and this is despite EU rhetoric suggesting that instead it is so. However, I would like to compare this with the momentous political impact that the war has had. And I have one slide in which I have tried to summarize the political impact on the EU system. We could mention the accession process, the requests, the applications that were triggered essentially by the war, pushing us to reflect on the boundaries of Europe, since Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, and Georgia have applied to be part of the EU in 2022. And the first two of which have already been granted candidate status. There is an impact of the war on European defense that is clear. The German Chancellor spoke about a Zeitenwende, an epochal turn, when he announced that Germany would do something that is quite a watershed in German history, namely doubling defense budget, putting Germany among the top spenders in absolute terms in the world after US and China. Finland and Sweden have requested to join NATO. Finland's bid came to fruition a few weeks ago, and on Sweden, I think we are bound to wait the outcome of the Turkish election in a few days. Denmark held a referendum immediately, a few months after the war, to opt in defense, to opt in EU decisions with defense implications. And there is also an unprecedented, I would say, showcase of solidarity between EU member states and between the member states and Ukraine, especially at the beginning of the war. I would say it is a surprising degree of consensus that was perhaps surprising even for the Russian elite. This is also a form of very close cooperation that we have seen also with other countries in the West. For example, NATO has stepped up its support not only to Ukraine, but also has deployed troops in neighboring countries. And now I would focus on the impact on the EU legal order, which I would first need to justify. Why do we talk about law, even though the violence of the war is meant to dwarf or to put in the background the legal technicalities? And in a sense, it's because it's all more important now to remember legal considerations. In fact, the view of the Russian president is that the actions are justified under international law. Putin, in his speech, refers to how the West, Zapad, in fact, invokes international law in order to hide American imperialism. So international law is very present in the Kremlin's rhetoric. And on the other hand, the notion of law is also very much present in the EU's rhetoric. This is because the EU is based on the rule of law. And in fact, the EU takes the view that everything that Putin says about international law is cynical. He does a disservice to the credibility of international law because, in fact, Russia opposes a power-based and prestige-based views of international relations to the EU's views of a system, of an international system as based on rules. So I think that law is not merely a technicality, but it is elevated to a foundational element of international politics. And this is what Putin had to say a couple of days ago on the Day of Victory, celebrating the end of World War II. The Western globalist elite's goal is to break apart and destroy our country, to make null and void the outcomes of World War II, to completely break down the system of global security and international law, to choke off any sovereign centers of development. So there is what I would call a disappointment with the uses of international law and what he calls the abuses of the UN Security Council in the uses of international law that I discuss a bit in the book, and I'm happy to come back to that in the comments. Now, focusing on EU law, I would say that we could distinguish three sectors of impact of the war on the EU legal order. The first is that sanctions contain constitutional experiments. The second is that the Commission has adopted a temporary crisis framework to grant exceptions or derogations from the state aid regime. And the third is the interesting administrative practices and experiments concerning visa ban for Russians entering the EU. I will focus on the first in the interest of time and try to explain a bit more, try to tease out what I mean by constitutional experiments. The sanctions that have been adopted against Russia, Belarus, and also certain Ukrainian individuals do not present revolutionary characteristics in the sense that they have been adopted by the actors that the treaties have put in charge of doing so according to the standard procedures, and they are the usual tools. So in a sense, the EU legal order, and this would be my main take-home point, the EU legal order has withstood the impact in the sense that there have been no explicit or implicit constitutional amendments. And this can be contrasted with what had happened in reaction to the financial crisis of the previous decades, to the migration crisis of 2015 or to COVID, where what we have witnessed was a form of hybrid action between the EU and the member states that blurred the boundaries between the former and the latter. It resulted in works of legal engineering, of international law, treaties that set up institutions that involved also EU institutions. So I'm thinking about the European Stability Mechanism, a treaty that foresees the involvement of the European Commission, and that is questionable whether it is inside or outside the EU legal order. Or adoption of soft law instruments in which it is unclear whether it is adopted by the EU institutions or by the member states. None of these happened in the case of the war against Ukraine, with a possible considerable exception in terms of institutional developments, which is the European political community, to which we might want to come back in the discussion. The sanctions, however, which pursue the threefold rationale of making Russia's war-sustaining effort materially impossible, to protect the EU's security and public order, as well as to signal, possibly to China, a strong condemnation of Russia's behavior, do contain an element of constitutional experimentation. And what is the constitutional experimentation here? It is the pursuit of a certain domestic policy through sanctions. And this is the first time that it has happened. Let me focus on one of these policies. In particular, it is the anti-disinformation policy. Other examples that I have mentioned, on which we can expand later if necessary, are criminal law and energy policy. But in the case of EU anti-disinformation policy, what the EU normally does is to adopt regulations or regulatory instruments that can be binding or soft law, that consists of trying to have the relevant social media adopt codes of conduct for their own monitoring of illegal content. So EU anti-disinformation policy is usually the Commission's prerogative. It is an internal market matter, and it is based on preemptive regulation. The sanctions against Russia contain instead also a prohibition, that is a ex post punishment to prohibit illegal content that is broadcasted by certain Russian-sponsored media outlets in the European Union. So the element of constitutional experimentation in the sanctions, the one that I highlight in this presentation, is contained in the sanctions against certain media outlets that are based in the EU. So the EU has censored EU-based companies because they were presenting content that the EU considers to be unlawful. They were presenting disinformation. And this is absolutely a first time. It's interesting that this has resulted already in a spectacular judgment of the General Court. The judgment is T 125/22, RT France and Council. The case is spectacular because, to my mind, it really tests how faithful a society is to its own values. It highlights the question whether the European Union can restrict freedom of information, freedom of expression, in order to preserve its public security and public order. In other words, the question that underlies this case, which is, I think, the question for the European Union more generally, and as well as the other actors who have adopted sanctions, the United Kingdom and the United States. The question is how to square the EU's interests with the EU's values. In a sense, and I will conclude on this, it might be in the EU's interest to stop the war as fast as possible, but stopping the war as soon as possible might mean to compromise with Russia, and compromising with Russia would potentially entail a violation of the EU's values of respect of international law and of the right to self-determinations of the Ukrainian, because because ending the war might entail making territorial concessions to Russia. I think that the difficulty is, as a matter of law, is how to square, how to balance EU interests and EU values. The EU primary law does not give does not contain the balancing, does not contain the terms of the balancing. EU secondary law, such as the sanctions, tries to strike a balance. So this is where I would conclude. Here is the practical effect of the sanctions on Russia. Russia now has its own that they cannot have McDonald's any longer. They don't use Instagram officially or Starbucks, but they have come up with their own version of McDonald's. So this concludes my presentation. Again, thank you enormously for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luigi, and also for that concluding thought. I think such a blatant attack on the global legal order, as we've seen perpetrated by Russia for the last year and a half, has really challenged the European Union, and so it's really interesting for us to then see some of the reaction of legal scholars based in Ukraine, and I should have perhaps emphasized that more. We're hosting speakers today here in Cambridge in our webinar from a country that is under military attack, and it's almost it's remarkable that the scholars, the lecturers, the professors based in Ukraine are continuing with their work and contributing to the global discussion. So our first respondent is Professor Taras Leshkovych. He's got a PhD in law and an LLM from the Central European University. He's senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law and senior project officer and local legal advisor of the Council of Europe office in Ukraine. Professor Leshkovych, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for organizing this event, for bringing us all together. Thank you to all the participants who joined to listen to us discussing this book. And also thank you to Luigi for writing this highly relevant, this very important book, this very topical at the moment. It is indeed relevant to analyze the situation, because in my opinion the period of war between Russia and Ukraine, starting from 2014 up until 2022, was very under-researched. It didn't attract as much attention as it should have, and it's not only in the scholarship but also in the EU's reaction and in other states' reaction, and that's where I want to make this bridge to Luigi's main claim that the reaction of EU was shaped by these two constraints: dependence on military dependence on US and NATO, and emergency energy dependence on Russia, and also the second claim that the EU's reaction was not revolutionary. I am not an expert on EU law, so I will provide more of a perspective from general public international law point of view, as well as some international criminal law and criminal justice perspective. Probably going a little bit beyond the book and providing some, apart from some comments on the book itself, providing some additional views to the war in Ukraine. So first of all, the idea that EU's reaction is not revolutionary, I completely agree. And I mostly agree with both of your premises. Of course, I would disagree, and I can discuss some of the points, but that's normal, because I think it would never happen that two lawyers would agree on everything. Lawyers tend to argue, lawyers tend to debate, to discuss things, to disagree on some minor points here and there. But largely, yes, I would agree, and I would say from my perspective as Ukrainian and as a legal scholar, that EU's reaction was good, but it was too late. and it has been too late. Unfortunately, it has been too late all the time. And we see it in Ukraine when there are discussions on transfer of some new type of military weapons to Ukraine. There is always this fear that no, we cannot do it because it would be an escalation, and we cannot do it. But then 3 months pass, this is done, and there is no escalation whatsoever. But I mean, for these delays, we are paying with the lives of our citizens, of our people. In general, yes, EU's reaction, sanctions, military assistance, financial assistance, humanitarian assistance, indeed, and I agree with what you claimed, that the reaction was stronger than probably Putin expected, and it was stronger than many people in Ukraine expected, because we were afraid that there might be a repetition of what has happened in 2014, that after the annexation of Crimea, there were some sanctions imposed on Russia, but those sanctions were although significant, but not nearly significant enough to stop them from escalating further. So the reaction, yes, the reaction is good, but it's at least 8 years too late. And if you speak from someone from Georgia, they will tell you that it's at least 15 years too late or 14 years too late, because Russia was always allowed to continue with their violations. And Russia has used plethora of legal justification of the annexation of Crimea, and then some new explanation after the so-called special military operation in February 2022. Sometimes these justifications are mutually exclusive, but that's also type of the strategy that they use, that you present as many explanations as possible, and then you leave it to your opponent to argue with each of those explanations. Starting from 2014, they first claimed that they are not present in Crimea. Those were not us. We are not there. These are local people who are fighting against junta in Kiev or this Nazi regime in Kiev. Then they claimed that, yes, we are here, but we are doing it by the invitation of the legitimate president Yanukovych, who asked us to intervene. Then they were claiming that we are trying to defend Russian nationals abroad or Russian-speaking minority abroad, and we are simply recognizing the legitimate will of people who decided to use their right for self-determination. They cite Kosovo precedents while not recognizing Kosovo precedent itself. So mutually exclusive explanations, mutually exclusive justifications, trying to simply create the confusion and put the burden of arguing on the opponent. Some of the points from your book, and they are indeed not main thesis, but because I agree with those. Some of the questions that you raised, for example, you're asking in your book that EU does not have Russia strategy, and that EU did not have Russia strategy before this full-scale invasion started, and their reaction was partially based on the fact that there was no Russia strategy, and it is true, there is no Russia. In my opinion, there is no clear Russia strategy right now, or what is already sometimes discussed in Ukraine, there is no post-Russia strategy. So no one in the West or no one outside of our region even comprehend the idea that Russia, in the form as it is today, this huge colonial empire, because it still is territorially an empire, and you write it yourself, that this territorial expansion of Russia throughout history and this multi-ethnic character, nobody can even comprehend that it might happen in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, that Russia might collapse and some new countries might be established in that place. And it might sound outrageous at the moment to even say so, but the same already happened 30 years ago or 32 years ago when Soviet Union collapsed. A few years before, nobody believed that this would happen. And we know it personally from our own history, because when President Bush at the time arrived in Kiev in July 1991, he gave this speech, which we dub now Chicken Kiev, because he was asking Ukraine not to leave Soviet Union. He was saying that Soviet Union is the only way to go, because we may not allow that new states will be created instead of this one country, and then you will have to deal with all those states, and different states might have nuclear weapons, so that's scary. So the same is essentially happening right now. Nobody is even talking about it, and I'm not sure if anybody is even thinking about the theoretical possibility of this happening. And this actually might happen, and this also leads to this idea that Russia's behavior is partially, or could be partially, explained by the fact that Russia was humiliated in the 90s. And it is a widely perceived idea in the Western scholarship, in the political circle, in the media, that in the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was somehow humiliated. And again, this is something that is very different for us in this Eastern European region, in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in Poland. Because for us, and historically, we see this situation much closer, and we probably have better insight into what has been happening and what is happening. So for us, Russia was not humiliated. Russia received unprecedented amount of investments. Russia received unprecedented amount of support with democratization throughout the 90s. Russia was allowed to stay on the Security Council, so nobody even questioned that Russia will continue to be a permanent member on the Security Council. Russia was a partner of NATO throughout the 90s, which again is sometimes forgotten, especially now when they claim that NATO is somehow tricked Gorbachev and promised never to expand, which Gorbachev himself disproved in one of his interviews. So yeah, it's a very interesting book, and I understand when you say that this is an intellectually appealing topic to write on. Indeed, I agree with you, and I understand that motivation. And what I would also like to add from my professional perspective, related more to criminal justice, of what EU has done already in this area. You did not explore that in your book, at least not in detail, but EU has been actually quite active in this area, especially related to international criminal justice. So there are two layers. One is what EU and EU institutions have been doing within Ukraine, providing capacity development support to Ukrainian government. And the EU has been present or has increased its presence in Ukraine in 2014. So apart from EU delegation, which is essentially a diplomatic body, we have EU advisory mission, which provides support with regards to civilian security sector reform. And before full-scale invasion, they focused exclusively on law enforcement, on criminal justice system, on judiciary. They never worked with anything closely related to the military. So after the full-scale invasion, they've also expanded into international crimes, into providing support with documentation, with prosecutions, with investigations. This is not something that they have been doing before. Same actually with the Council of Europe, but that's another organization. We will not go there today. There's also another project called EU Pravo Justice. They also provide support with that, but that's on national level. So they help Ukrainian authorities to deal with the situation. On the international level, on the EU level, Eurojust has been quite active in that sense. So already back in March 2022, so more than a year ago, a joint investigation team was created by Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania under the framework of Eurojust. So the idea was that these countries will provide support to Ukraine in investigations of war crimes or war-related crimes more generally. Later, Estonia, Latvia, and Slovakia joined, and then Romania also joined. So this joint investigative team now includes 7 countries, plus Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court joined this essentially as observer. So the idea is to help Ukraine with collecting evidence, because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees are outside Ukraine who are potentially victims or witnesses of war-related crimes. So the idea is that they will provide support with collecting evidence and potentially even bringing cases to trial. Another aspect of this international support from the EU is that EU has been quite active in providing support with establishment of special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. So due to jurisdictional constraints, the International Criminal Court cannot prosecute crime of aggression. And Ukraine as a state cannot prosecute the crime of aggression against the highest level officials of Russia due to head of state immunity. So Ukraine cannot prosecute president or prime minister or minister of foreign affairs. So there is these discussions right now about the establishment of a special tribunal, and EU has been very vocal and very active in that sense. So it is not clear yet what specific model will be chosen, whether the tribunal will be established, but what has already been done is the declaration by the European Parliament supporting the idea of establishment of the tribunal. Similar declarations were adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, by NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and also the EU went a little bit beyond that. And the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression was established again under the auspices of the Eurojust. So the idea is that this center will be collecting evidence, will be paving the way for the tribunal that hopefully will be established in the future. I think I will stop here. Thank you once again, Luigi, for writing the book. It was very interesting to read. I enjoyed reading it, actually, the same as I enjoy being part of this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Taras. Fantastic to hear your thoughts on this, and I completely agree. The crime of aggression clearly perpetrated at the highest level of the current Russian Federation government has to be prosecuted. And I say that coming from a country that basically through the Nuremberg trials only came to terms with the scale and scope of the crimes committed in neighboring countries. So moving right forward, our next speaker is Dr. Maxim Kolyba. He's senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law. He's also serving as deputy director for Administrative Affairs and Development at the International Institute for Ethics and Contemporary Issues. Maxim, you have the floor. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to discuss the book. It is an honor to be here with you. I also consider it very important that the issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war is considered at an academic level in Europe. This is really a topic that will require a lot of research in various fields, including the legal field. My speech will be quite similar to Taras' speech, but it will focus more on the historical and philosophical foundations of the functioning of the Russian Federation and its relations with Ukraine, since I'm a philosopher of law. I very much agree with the assessment and description of the legal actions of the EU regarding Russia, sanctions and relations. They are truly unprecedented and very important to end this war. However, I would like to put the main emphasis on the book itself and on the general perception of the Russian Federation in the Western world, especially in Western Europe. The red thread running through the entire text, as I saw, maybe I'm wrong, is the idea that in any case, it is necessary to think about future relations with Russia and efforts to connect it with Europe, because otherwise China will strengthen its forces. I see the logic in the Dr. Lonardo's conclusions, especially given the desire for long-term peace in Europe. However, if the conclusions can be correct, then I see some incorrect premises, which accordingly give rise to incorrect results of reasoning. Western policies, in general, after the Second World War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for various reasons, act as if Russia is on the same level of understanding of politics and society as the countries of the West, and on the same level of understanding of human rights and freedoms, as well as democracy. So the the perception of Russia as a national state like France, Italy, Germany, or the UK. Instead, we in Ukraine, like the Baltic countries and Poland, understand such an error of such a perception. Because Russia is not a national democratic state. Russia is an empire that did not completely disintegrate after the First World War, as did the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, the Bolsheviks became the fuse of disintegration. And through terror, they transformed the state from revolutionary disintegration to the most centralized apparatus. Under the guise of fake republics, after the destruction of real independent national entities, a union which had to be confederation was illegitimately formed. Also, in fact, the vertical of one party and one leader was centralized. After the announcement of the creation of the Soviet Union, there were thousands of rebellions against the authorities on the territory of Ukraine until the 1930s, which resulted in an artificial famine, Holodomor. Thanks to it, the Soviet government succeeded in suppressing the resistance of the Ukrainian people against collectivism and the Soviet Union in itself. To understand Russia, in my opinion, it is not necessary to appeal to the desire for eternal peace, which came thanks to the leaders of France and Germany in 40s and 50s in the last century, because Russia never had a desire for eternal peace. On the contrary, it was Stalin together with Hitler who started the Second World War, not Hitler alone. It was Stalin who, as a result of the war, gained more territory, not the United States and its allies. In my point of view, there is in Western world, I see there must be no reason to look for the causes for Russia's war aggression against Ukraine in their explanations and justifications. Throughout human history, most aggressors did not want to be seen as aggressors. All had justifications, whether historical, mythical, occult, or religious. However, one way or another, an aggressive war were carried out. For better understanding of Russian imperialism, we can look at recent history, the 19th of the 20th century, about what Taras was saying. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia immediately included the mechanisms of inter-ethnic or pseudo-ethnic conflicts in the post-Soviet space. Transnistria, 1992, Karabakh, 1991, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, 1992. And later, Russia recognized part of all of these quasi-states, and Transnistria once asked to be included in Russia. Subsequently, this same scenario was created on the territory of Ukraine. Terrorist organizations here in Ukraine, DNR and LNR, so Donetsk and Luhansk People Republic. During the democratic years of 1990s, Russia did not allow Tatarstan, which voted for independence, to secede from its composition, and military prevented the exit of Chechnya and Dagestan. And all these things happened before Putin. The issue of Crimea was raised not only in 2014, but also in 1993. It's not about what NATO does or doesn't do, or whether anyone gave any guarantees, which there weren't. The point is how one understands sovereignty. The West predominantly understands sovereignty as a quality that is obtained and realized through civil society, the rule of law, and international law. Russia understands it as the will of the king or anyone in a high position. China adheres to a similar concept of sovereignty, but it is the main party here, the party there in China, although Xi Jinping's course towards the centralization of power is now clearly visible. Accordingly, Ukraine, as a country of West, as we believe, considers sovereignty to be the will of the Ukrainian people, which legally chooses the government, which is divided into three branches. And this government fulfills its promises, which Ukrainians want to see. Today, it is the EU and NATO. On the other hand, there are no elections in Russia as such, despite the fact that officially it should be a federation. In fact, the only leader for more than 20 years, the destruction of the institution of election of governors and mayors, support for the one true policy is not the result of propaganda alone. The choice of imperial policy associated with the 19th or even 17th century is a regularity. Throughout its history, from Peter I to today, Russia has had only two serious periods of democracy. The first is February-October 1917. The second is 1991-2000. In the first case, it was the Russian people who supported the Bolshevik dictatorship of the proletariat. In the second case, they elected Putin, who was KGB agent. We must understand that there are other worlds in the world besides the Western one, which offers a wide range of democratic opportunities. There is China and 1.5 billion people who support the idea of sovereign great powers, where smaller ones should be in their orbit. There are many millions of people to whom Sharia norms are normal. And there is Russia, for which it is normal to renounce the primacy of international law, for which it is normal to leave the number of participants of the European Convention on Human Rights. Also, as lawyers, we have to be precise in wording because they create consequences that can legitimize unacceptable things. For example, there was no referendum in Crimea in 2014. Because in order for this to happen, at least there should be appropriate legislation. And I must remind about the illegal presence of the military of the Russian Federation. There is also no concept of the Donbass because it is only an old definition of a coal basin. In addition, so-called DNR and LNR, this public People Republic, recognized by Ukraine as a terrorist organizations, operated only in a few districts in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Instead, Donbass extends to the Zaporizhia region and part of Russian Federation. After all, I suppose that we can all agree with this. How can Europe think about business as usual with those who killed 6 children with rockets and drones on 28th of April in Uman? And those who already killed thousands of innocent people, including at least 500 of children. It is in accordance with European values to negotiate with terrorists? I don't think so. After all, this is terror, not just a war of one military against one another. So I must conclude. Yes, there should be such studies because after all, we will somehow have to live together. We are extremely grateful to the EU and other partners for financial, social, and military assistance. Help, not assistance. Without it, we probably wouldn't have been able to last so long. Thank you for perceiving Ukraine as a part of the West and as a defender of freedoms important to the West. However, Russia is not a sacred cow that cannot be condemned. For today, after a year and almost 3 months of a full-scale invasion, any planning for the future must be based on one constant, in my point of view. Russia is a terrorist state. Because if we leave this racism unpunished, if we forget the crimes that have characteristics of genocide of Ukrainians, we will thereby give the opportunity to other regimes and other countries with imperial attitudes to act freely outside the legal field and outside international law. Thank you very much. I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maxim. That was very clear. And you know, we recognize that there are very few countries that have their head of state, their president, indicted before the International Criminal Court. Of course, what I would like to do is briefly give the floor back to Luigi to give us some brief reactions and then open up the question and answer session. Luigi.
Thank you, Taras. Thank you, Maxim, for your comments. I think it's an excellent start of the debate because the debate is what I think we should be having. Sorry, Maxim, you were sensitive enough not to call into question my conclusions, but only the reasoning. However, I think that we disagree on the conclusion, not on the premises. We draw different conclusions from the same premises. I mentioned Uvarov's triad, samodержавие, народность, and Pravoslavia. On the Samodarzhavie, we are entirely there. We agree the tradition of constitutional democracy that was experienced in Western Europe from the end of the 18th century onward is foreign to the Russian tradition. The 1917 revolution has not brought that to Russia. Russia has not experienced it, not even in the 90s, not to the same extent as the West does. So that's why I mentioned the role of Russia in history, or its self-perception in history. There is an important doctrine, an important idea in Russian international political thought that justifies the role of Russia as the defender of a model that is in antithesis to the constitutional rights-based understanding of the rule of law that France and England have established as the orthodoxy in Western Europe. But for me, that is not a reason not to be confident that the model established in France and England and then copied more or less successfully in Western Europe and now in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's not a reason not to be confident that that model produces better results for people and citizens, and therefore that model cannot be at the basis of a constructive dialogue. And the question is, how much can you insist on that model in the face of obvious resistance? And as a lawyer, that is a question that I try to argue with in relation to what the fundamental texts of the European Union, so the fundamental treaties of the European Union, tell me. I don't think that there is an answer there. So this is why the debate is very important. And this also links to the point that Taras was mentioning. Of course, I don't dedicate much attention to the efforts of the European External Action Service in cooperating with international institutions, with the ICC. You're entirely correct, and you have obviously already recalled the main steps of this cooperation, including the European Parliament resolution for the establishment of an ad hoc tribunal, considering the jurisdictional limits of the ICC on that. It is not just a question of law there, of course. There is also a question, as always with international criminal justice, of political opportunity. There is an inherent tension in the goal of international criminal justice between the promise of retribution, the promise of satisfaction to the victim, and of course the aim to end hostilities. In other words, one could take the cynical view that the arrest warrant against Putin makes it more difficult for leaders to be seen negotiating with Putin. Although I repeat, I think that at some point it is too obviously in the interests of at least of the European Union to sit down at a table with the Russian leaders. However, it doesn't necessarily need to be the current Russian leadership, that however opens up a completely different world of speculation. I think in the book I mentioned a 1917 scenario in which a provisional government would need to accept anything just in order to end the hostilities, but at the moment that's pure speculation from my side. So thank you enormously. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Luigi. And let's open up the floor to questions. I'm personally very grateful that no one sat down with Hitler to negotiate peace in Europe during the Second World War, but
they did before, though. No, they did until
well,
39.
they tried, and they were deceived actively, and I think that's the state we're in with regards to the Russian Federation at the moment. But be that as it may, and it's not exactly my area, let's come back to the European Union and what this clear challenge means for the European Union. Could I invite questions? And I know Nataliya has been waiting to ask a question. Nataliya, go ahead. And I should invite the audience to please use the Q&A button for their questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, this book is a very interesting example of multidisciplinary research, and it was a very interesting intellectual exercise for me. I totally side with my colleagues who have discussed this book from philosophic point of view, international criminal law point of view. I would add my 5 cents from the international economic law point of view. And the main question in my view is, what is the point when the Russian aggression against Ukraine has started? One may say it's 2022, and one may say 2014. I would suggest the date 2013, and I would explain why is it so. Starting from 2013, Russia has started putting an economic pressure on Ukraine, starting chocolate wars, cheese wars, putting a pressure on Ukrainian exporters, and totally stopping exports from Ukraine to other countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And at that point of time, it is important to note that European market was closed for Ukrainian products because we didn't have free trade agreement with the European Union. So it was traditional trade flows through Russia to other countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and many, many others. And Russia starts putting this pressure on Ukraine, economic pressure, just to make sure Ukraine will be in the orbit of Russia. So is this an aggression? Definitely, this is an economic aggression. And later we received a physical aggression, military aggression in 2014, which was, in my opinion, a natural continuation of this economic pressure. So Ukraine has withstood this economic pressure and indeed signed the association agreement, and this was the right sign. And later, do we receive an appropriate response from the European Union, judging from this history of the economic pressure? It's disputable, because whether the sanctions were harsh enough in order to stop Russia from continuing military operations in Ukraine, that is also a very difficult question to answer. If we judge only response of the European Union starting from 2022, I think it will be a very narrow point of view. I think it's important to judge starting from the 2014 in order to fully understand what was actually happening. And if we analyze Russia's actions and the European Union response from the 2014, we can understand that some words that Putin is saying are just the cover for some commercial and mercantile interests, and that's why we receive this blockade of seaports. That's why we see that the main idea of the Russian leader is to make Ukraine a failed state, to show that Ukraine is economically unviable. And that's why we appreciate very much. We are very grateful to the European Union for the response, but we humbly are saying that this response could have been harsher in 2014, and that's why it will be much easier right now to deal with Russia. So I have 2 questions, and my first question is, can we really interpret Putin's words directly, or maybe we can just understand them as a cover for something else, and that can shape our legal response and political response? And my second question is on a different area. In 1994, Ukraine has signed the Budapest Memorandum and gave away its nuclear power. And definitely all current member states of the European Union supported this idea, and Ukraine performed its obligations, and Union gave all some of its missiles to Russia. And now we receive an aggression from Russia. So did the fact that Ukraine signed Budapest Memorandum, and maybe it was a wrong policy choice for the European Union members to support at that time signing of this Budapest Memorandum, shaped the European Union response to the aggression of Ukraine. So these are two my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nataliya. And before I give the floor back, I'd like to ask a question to all three speakers, what they expect the next steps are going to be, right? So we all know that formal negotiations for accession could start very soon. Ukraine has the status now of a candidate country, which is, as Luigi said, unprecedented in terms of the time frame. I'm expecting a few more firsts. I'm very confident that in the not too distant future, we'll see Ukraine as a full-fledged member of the European Union. And I was wondering whether, what the effect of having Ukraine as an EU member state would be on the EU legal order and especially the foreign policy of the European Union. So if you had a crystal ball, how would Ukraine's EU membership shape EU foreign policy towards the rest of the world, is my question. Luigi, if we start with you, two very challenging questions from Nataliya, and one maybe slightly more softball question from me. Go ahead, Luigi. And we need to keep answers relatively short. I apologize. We're slowly running out of time.
I'll try to be as short as possible. The response to the Budapest Memoranda has shaped the EU policy. I would say the Budapest Memoranda were perfectly in line with history at the moment. There was nothing surprising with countries renouncing nuclear weapons. It was, in fact, the main issue of cooperation, the main foreign policy issue of the Bush presidency until 11th of September 2001 was the denuclearization of the United States and Russia. It was, I think, only this war that has put the clock back to the darkest hour of the 20th century, and we're talking about nuclear weapons again. It is, in fact, Russia's narrative to bring into the discourse the Budapest Memorandum by saying, "Hey, but you had promised that." And now look at what Ukraine is doing. And the reason why they're doing that is that perhaps naively Zelensky did mention, unless we get the guarantee that we're promised, then we might need to rethink the Budapest Memoranda. And I'm not even sure how binding they are under international law, but I do not want to go into the question. So I don't think that was... that is the most significant development. More significant are the Minsk agreements, and this also links back to the difference between 2014 and 2022. In 2022, it became too obvious the situation became too obvious. In 2014, there was still an attempt, not brokered by the European Union, by the way, but by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to sit down on the table, find an agreement, and two agreements were found, two ceasefires, truces were brokered, and at that time it proved insufficient. Is Russia's war about something else? That I don't know. I cannot fathom enough what is going on in the decision-making processes there. It seems to be a spectacular intelligence failure, if it is, if the assessment is correct from the outside. There have been other spectacular failures in Russian intelligence operation abroad. You might remember when the Russian agents were caught in the minivan outside the European Nuclear Agency in the Netherlands, trying to hack into their computer. So I don't know if that is if that explains some human mistake very high up explains the failure, the communication failure, the disorganization of the army, and so on. Is there? So I don't know. There is also a domestic audience that Putin needs to appease, although it's easier for him since it is not. Since he doesn't face meaningful electoral challenges. And the final question, how would EU foreign policy change with Ukrainian membership? At the moment, I think we are still talking about something that will happen in the medium or long term, despite the promises, because the practice shows that accession process takes several years to be brought to fruition. I think it would show that, in a sense, the European Union has not only accepted a logic of political confrontation over the eastern boundary of Europe, but that the European Union has won that part, because Ukraine has obviously chosen one side. The Belarusian people, seems to me, are also much closer to the European Union than the current president of Belarus would like to think. There is a strong opposition but Belarus has a strong opposition. So I think that would be conceptually the main shift. There is a logic of expansion, and I use the word expansion in inverted commas because it's not that the European Union is marching toward the east, it's that countries want to join the European Union. So that's yes, that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Taras, and then Maxi.
Thank you. There is another spectacular failure of Russian intelligence when a Russian spy tried to work as an intern at the International Criminal Court posing as a Brazilian citizen and was arrested by Dutch police. So there are a lot of interesting stories like that. If I may, I would like to comment a little bit on Budapest Memorandum and then to answer your question, Markus. Actually, the Budapest Memorandum is a perfect example of how Ukraine, in fact, we can say was humiliated in the 90s by the West, not Russia, because Ukraine was pressured essentially by the United States, by UK, to give up its nuclear arsenal. It's not that Ukraine was not willing to do so, but they I mean, US and UK were so careful in framing the wording of the Budapest Memorandum that it doesn't even include guarantees. They provided only assurances. So essentially, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, third nuclear arsenal in the world at the time, essentially for nothing. So the only assurance was provided that in case Ukraine is attacked, then signatories of the Budapest Memorandum will discuss the ways to resolve this problem. So that was an empty document, basically, but somehow this is overlooked. So somehow there is more narrative on Russian humiliation, but not focusing on this aspect, for example. To answer your question, Markus, as to how we see, like, looking into the crystal ball and what we expect from the Ukrainian future and the EU future, and what would be the changes for the EU foreign policy if or when Ukraine becomes a member. So I think that Ukraine would lead the EU foreign policy in the region in the similar way as Poland and Baltic states do at the moment. So they are they often push the narrative, they often push the direction with regards to neighbors. So I think that would be the role for Ukraine with regards to Caucasus, to Moldova to a certain extent, also with Romania, of course, to Belarus, to Russia or post-Russia or whatever will be its form at the time. With regards to EU accession, I am confident that it will happen. But when it will happen, a lot would also depend on Ukrainian authorities because there's still a lot of homework to be done. So essentially, this EU candidacy was I don't want to say a gift, but it was an advance taking into account the situation in Ukraine. But in order to achieve full membership, a lot of work needs to be done by Ukrainian authorities. So yes, when it will happen also depends on us here in Ukraine. To bring this discussion a little bit back to my field, I would expect that Ukraine, after the victory, after the peace is achieved, that Ukraine would lead international efforts in the area of criminal justice, being the victim itself, that Ukraine would be similar to how the Netherlands, for example, are a strong actor in this global justice politics. I would like Ukraine to be another important player in that regard. But again, for that we need to ratify the Rome Statute first, just as one of the practical examples. So a lot will depend on us in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxime.
Yeah, thanks. My thought about what can Ukraine bring to EU when it is a member of EU. I think that must be the change of the policy itself in EU. I think that there must be some changing the policy, which is the policy of the end of the history, right? So everything is peaceful, and we do not want some forces, because every country in the world want to live under the international law and such way. Because now we see that this is just one point of view, right? We think this is right, international human rights, international law, but I think that I suppose that EU will change the policy and make some military changes at first. So yes, so I don't suppose that it will be maybe one country, like, yes, but maybe some changes about military forces, maybe something like NATO or something inside EU, but there must be such forces, because we can't change the world now, and we can't punish all the terrorist states and terrorists by themselves. So, and of course, I hope that Ukraine will bring to EU some changes in sphere of IT, of this governmental issues, that we have something to give to you, right? So to change for our mutual development. That's my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have time for 2 more questions from the audience. And by the way, I completely agree. I think the sort of membership of Ukraine in the European Union is absolutely essential for the future of the European Union itself. But we'll discuss that. I have a fantastic question from our mutual friend Artem Chaipov. Artem, why don't you ask your question yourself? If you can turn on your video.
Sure. Thank you so much, Markus, and many thanks to everyone participating, contributing to this excellent discussion. The question goes as follows. It's related to the EU's reaction to Hungary, whether it was sufficient or not. Because in Ukraine, a lot of people are very much concerned about Hungary's stance towards Ukraine and Hungary's respect for the European values and policies. And I was wondering if you could comment on this issue and share your perception as to whether the EU has enough, legal mechanisms, political mechanisms to ensure compliance with EU values and policies vis-a-vis separate member states. Thank you.
Yeah, a fantastic question, and I might chip in after Luigi and our speakers. We have another question from Maria Orzechowska, who asked, who says, as you mentioned, the main factors that suspended the EU's reactions were military and energy dependence. Do you see ways and mechanisms to prevent strong dependencies like these between states, or is it inevitable in situations like this will happen again sooner or later? Two fantastic questions. Luigi, if you could take a turn, and then I might come back on the Hungarian question as well.
I start with the Hungarian question. It's conceptually very important to address the rule of law issues, because it seems to be one of the differences between a perceived us and a perceived them. The reason why the people of Ukraine want to join the European Union is precisely because they want to have those values. They share the same premises, and Hungary is perceived to be rowing in the opposite direction. In fact, it's not just perceived to be; it's also vetoing for the time being Swedish accession to NATO, in addition to Turkey. It has been able to negotiate a complex system of derogations from the sanctions when it comes to energy dependence. Does the EU have sufficient? I think it does. As a matter of law, you can find it there. It is difficult to avoid the perception of a European Union as a hostile actor against Hungary, because that is Orban's narrative, which I think is entirely incorrect. I don't think that the European Union and Hungary's interests are contraposed, and the fight is to be picked there. But in terms, the question was raised as does it have enough instruments? And the answer is yes. I think it has. Should it have better mechanisms? No, I think it already has the mechanisms for ensuring it. And on the other question on energy dependence, energy dependence is a fact. It is a fact of the world that depends on the presence or not of resources, natural resources. So the European Union is not as rich in gas and oil as Norway or Russia or Nigeria are. This is a matter of fact. So to the extent that this fact, geographical fact, continues, then an asymmetry between European Union and producers and exporters of oil and gas will always exist. There are mechanisms put in place to modify that. The green transition being one, the energy platform being another. These are essentially ways that the European Union has adopted before or during the war to diversify the sources of energy. So one way to eliminate the asymmetry is simply to say we will not rely on oil at all, or we will try to rely on renewable energies and whatnot, so things that we can produce in-house. Another way is to say instead of depending on Russia, we will depend on Algeria, which seems to be the trend. but that also carries political risks, risks of depending on a country whose political system is not that does not necessarily share the same values as the European Union. On the military, I will not answer for questions of time, but you can have a look at the book where as I mentioned this.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Yes, thank you very much, Artem, for your question. I think you're quite rightly putting the finger on some of the weaknesses. I myself tried to answer some of those questions in Europe's second constitution, my most recent book. But going forward, I think we need to also not underestimate the power, for example, of institutions beside the European Commission. So putting everything on the Commission might not be right. I think the Parliament, the Council, and the Court of Justice in the end have a role to play in defending the fundamental values, which sometimes seem to be at sea in some of the member states, including in Hungary. So I'm vesting quite a bit of confidence in the Luxembourg judges in this regard, and we've seen quite sweeping and important judgments. We had these two questions. I'm going back to Taras and then Maxime.
Do we have the time?
We have
how short
1 minute answers. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think I will. I will answer on Hungary because I'm not an expert in EU law. Just a brief remark that I think something needs to be done because this is not sustainable way to have a member state who is essentially undermining common values, common policy. With regards to energy dependency and military dependency, I think at least with regards to military dependency, European states have learned the lessons. So now several states are increasing their budget, are rebuilding their armies, because for decades, everyone believed that there will be no big war, so we don't need big armies. And apparently big war can still happen on the European continent. Same with the energy dependency. I think that the diversification is the answer here. And of course, there are some natural and geographical limits that if you don't have oil resources, then you will not find oil resources within your territories. But even with energy dependency on Russia, there were ways to minimize the threat from Russia. So for example, when Ukraine tried to point down to the fact that these Nord Stream pipelines, that they are not economic tools or economic mechanisms, but essentially political mechanisms to put pressure on Ukraine, to kind of further the pressure on Ukraine, that no one in Germany listened, because all Germany wanted was cheap gas, and sorry, but Germany didn't care enough about security risks for Ukraine. Should there be no Nord Stream pipelines and all the gas would go through Ukraine or Belarus as it used to be before, then Russia would be much more cautious in its use of force against Ukraine. So yeah, I think thinking beyond short-term economic gains is key in this regard.
Couldn't agree more. Maxime.
Yes, about the dependence, I can say that this is the case about what I said earlier about the end of history, right? So the EU countries, and not only EU countries, but European countries, I think that they must change their politics, policy, right? To stay more strength, right? To strengthen their military and energetic policies for such language. So I think it must be done, and I suppose that European countries already understood it. About Hungary, I think that this is the same question about the sovereignty, because Orban is quite similar to Putin, right? I think the case why did not Orban put its military to Ukraine is about just Ukrainian forces, and that Hungary is smaller than Ukraine. Because we have to remember that Orban, quite before the full-scale invasion, was in Moscow. So I can't remember why was he a day or two before the full-scale invasion, right? Maybe 23rd or 23rd or 22nd of February 2022. So he's not only him, but several days ago, or yesterday or several days ago, military, I think, Minister of Defense of Hungary said that in the Second World War there had to be some negotiations with Hitler. So how can we accept it? I don't know. Yes, he said it, and Poland already said that. What are you saying? So now he is talking about that there had to be negotiation with Hitler, and the World War II wouldn't happen here, right? So like it was. So I think that Europe and EU must somehow react at it, because it is a violation of the principles of EU and human rights. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maxime. And I think we all recognize that it's not just undermining Ukraine's security, it undermines the security of many EU states, including the Baltic states and Poland, but also in theory, Eastern Germany, the Czech Republic, and the former states of Yugoslavia. I mean, this, compromising on these items would be really, really dangerous for the European Union itself. Thank you very much on behalf of the Center for European Legal Studies here at the University of Cambridge. This was a fantastic discussion, and hopefully just the start of a fruitful collaboration. The last word in this webinar goes to Nataliya.
It is my pleasure to say thank you to all participants, to Luigi, to you, Markus, for organizing this wonderful event on behalf of the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Law. And indeed, at the UCU, we always say values come first. And I think it's good words to finalize our today's discussions, that values are very important for shaping legal provisions. And with that in mind, I would like to thank you all participants for very interesting questions. I think this is a very fruitful discussion, which can result maybe in some publications in the future.
Thank you very much. And with that, we end our webinar, but we start our collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The best.